I get asked all the time in the comments section if people should worry that they are spotting or bleeding in their first trimester. It's a little scary to see blood because heavy bleeding could be a sign that you are miscarrying. But if you are having a little spotting or bleeding, does that automatically mean you are having a miscarriage? I'm going to be answering that question in this video. But first, if you're new here, my name is Diana. I'm a physician assistant and I specialize in women's health and gynecology. You are watching In the Pink, and if you're new here, In the Pink means in good health and spirits. So if you like being healthy and happy, make sure to click that subscribe button because you are in the right place. Now, before I jump in, I would like to hear from you. Where are you coming from? Are you pregnant now? Are you thinking about getting pregnant, or are you a spouse or a partner of somebody that is pregnant? I'd love to know. Put that in the comment section down below. So bleeding during your pregnancy is a relatively common thing to happen. And in the first trimester, it can happen in 15 to 25 out of 100 pregnancies. So about 1 in 4 to 5 women will bleed before the week 14. And that number goes up even higher if you had infertility treatments to get pregnant, like with IVF. Now, there are a lot of different causes for bleeding, and virtually none of those causes are from the baby bleeding. Yes, the bleeding can be from a miscarriage or from an ectopic pregnancy, which is a pregnancy outside of the uterus, but it can also be from the cervix, which tends to bleed more easily when you're pregnant because of more blood vessels forming on the cervix. This might cause a little bleeding after sex or after a pap test. Also, a small rupture of the blood vessels in the endometrium can cause a little bit of bleeding. A vaginal infection, a polyp, or a fibroid, or it can be from something called implantation bleeding. Now, the hypothesis behind implantation bleeding is that around 4 to 5 weeks, as the embryo is burrowing into the endometrium to get its blood supply, it sometimes leads to a little bit of light bleeding. Although more recently, this hypothesis is being questioned. So let's take a look at what first trimester bleeding might look like. Most women will describe their bleeding as just light bleeding or spotting, and about half of those episodes are very short-lived, like less than a day. Only about 10% of women actually describe their bleeding as heavy or clotty. So usually, light spotting or bleeding that is short-lived is not really anything to worry about. It's also important to point out that the timing of the bleeding won't predict whether the bleeding will lead to a miscarriage or not. So most of the time, if you bleed, it's usually between 5 and 8 weeks. But whether you bleed then or later in the first trimester, or even if you bleed very early in the pregnancy, like before 5 weeks, the timing alone doesn't indicate whether you will or won't miscarry. So what does? Well, there was a study that showed that 12% of women who were bleeding in their first trimester went on to have a miscarriage. But 13% of women who didn't bleed also went on to have a miscarriage. The risk of miscarriage does seem to go up the heavier the bleeding, but even really heavy bleeding doesn't always mean a miscarriage, but the chances are higher that it is. That being said, the older you are when you're pregnant, the more likely you are to miscarry if you were to have any kind of bleeding. And by the way, for any of you who are worrying because they are a little bit older and pregnant, I had my last 2 babies at 39 and 42, and I am loving every second of it, just so you know. If you are bleeding, it's very reassuring to see your OB. While they're there, they might do 2 things. They might check an ultrasound or check blood levels for HCG, which stands for human chorionic gonadotropins, or they might do both. Your body starts to produce HCG when you first become pregnant, and it's the same hormone that a urine pregnancy test checks for. If your OB is monitoring your HCG levels through a blood test, then they can follow how much it's increasing every 48 hours. They're looking for the HCG levels to double every 2 days. If they aren't exactly doubling every 2 days, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will have a miscarriage, but the less the HCG levels are rising, the more likely it is that you are having a miscarriage or an ectopic pregnancy. If your OB or midwife does a particular ultrasound called a transvaginal ultrasound, they can see a heartbeat as early as 6 weeks. And if they do see the heartbeat, that is very reassuring. Seeing a strong heartbeat at 6 weeks means that there is a 78% chance that everything is great and that you aren't miscarrying. If you see a heartbeat at 8 weeks, the chance that the pregnancy will continue jumps up to 98%. And if you see a heartbeat at 10 weeks, go ahead and send out the baby announcements, because there's only like a 0.6% chance that you will have a miscarriage. So like 99.4% of the time, the pregnancy is fine. Now, if you see an OB and find out that you are having a miscarriage, first off, let me offer my condolences, and please know that most of the time it's not something that you did to cause it. About 70% of the time, miscarriages are from a genetic or chromosomal abnormality. You didn't cause it by having sex or by exercising. Coffee in moderation doesn't cause a miscarriage, and it wasn't caused by anything you ate, unless you got certain foodborne illnesses from it. Many miscarriages happen before you even knew you were pregnant. Now, if you have miscarried and you are smoking, drinking way too much caffeine, or using drugs or alcohol, that can increase your chances of having a miscarriage in the first trimester. So if this is you, please talk to your OB about getting help to quit. I would say overall, if you are having bleeding at any point in your pregnancy, you need to be evaluated by your OB. But if you are bleeding in your first trimester, you don't need to panic. Most of the time, the bleeding will not lead to a miscarriage. Still, see your OB so they can make sure that everything is okay. Now, if you are brand new to my channel, I have made an entire pregnancy series where I walk you through pregnancy week by week, and I talk about baby development, your body changes, what to expect at your next appointment, basically everything that you need to know about your pregnancy each week. I'm gonna link to that playlist right here. Check it out, find the week that you're at, maybe watch a week or two earlier to get caught up. So click on that link right here, and I will see you over there.